On July 26, experts from around the nation gathered for the first time to discuss the methods for prediction and prevention of multiple shootings in schools.
I want to use my opening remarks to accomplish two tasks. The first is to welcome you, and I think that's a fairly obvious task. And the second, I think, is less obvious. It's to set the stage for this important discussion. Let me begin with the welcome. Sometimes it's useful to state the obvious. This is an important conference. This is a crucial conference because we face a serious and deadly problem of school violence. And we face this problem not just in the mass violence that we see in the media circus around the multiple shootings over the last year, but also in the one-by-one violence that is just as deadly and equally as heartbreaking, but doesn't get the same kind of media attention. Everyone in this room knows the importance of the topic. I want to thank you warmly for coming. You are all part of the solution, and I think that's a very important message to begin with. You are here because you're experts, and together we need each other's expertise. Your commitment to young people, your expertise as teachers, as school administrators, as peace officers, as health and social service professionals, and importantly as parents and uncles and aunts, are part of what we need to solve this problem. Your collective knowledge and insight will make this a very special day. Predicting and preventing school violence is what this conference is about. And in just a few moments, we will be hip deep in all the specifics of solving that problem. My second task is to put this particular problem of adolescence in a larger context. Taking a leaf from CNN's book, I want to provide 10 factoids about adolescence. So let me start with our favorite question. Who are adolescents? Everyone here has a personal definition, and each probably has a professional definition. The typical definition of adolescence is lists a series of psychosocial and biological changes during an age range. The question is, what age range? And maybe because I'm a university professor and dean by training rather than a high school educator, I like the one from the World Health Organization best. The World Health Organization says that adolescence goes from 12 to 25, not the definition you usually hear. They say 12 rather than 10, which is often a definition used in the US, because they don't want to encourage child marriage. So they've chosen 12 to help create a kind of barrier to early marriage, especially for girls. And they've chosen 25 because there are certain brain and developmental changes about good judgment that don't happen until your middle 20s. As someone who teaches in I hear some laughing in the audience. It's nonetheless true. Actually, there's some brain and developmental changes that don't happen until you're 35. It's important, however, it's true. What can I say? You know, it's the dilemma of being in a university. You know these things. How many children, note this is not adolescents, it's children, live in households with incomes under the poverty line? The answer is 14.1 million. I know that the most visible cases of mass school violence in the last few years have not been in schools in poor communities. But as a social scientist, as a researcher, the overall patterns of violence toward kids this age makes me want to ask a question that I don't think anybody is looking at. And that question is, why is it that it appears, I don't know if this is the fact, why is it that it appears that one-to-one violence or one victim at a time violence is typical in poor neighborhoods, and more mass violence is at least more visible and better off neighborhoods? Is this an artifact of media reporting? Is it actually the truth? We don't know yet. What's the sixth factoid? What is the pattern of drug and alcohol use of teenagers? In a very large national survey, quite sophisticated, over 11% of kids aged 12 to 17 report using illicit drugs in the month before they were questioned. The typical drug, not surprising, is marijuana. A full 55% of adolescents report going to religious service at least once during a week before an interview. And I think that's a fairly high number. I mean, it's probably 3 times the number of any European country. But only about 13% say that religion influences them a great deal. So they go, but they don't consider it among their most important influences. How much access do adolescents have to guns? Again, there are lots of data on this. But reports by teenagers show that 50% of the teenagers think that there's a gun in their house. Now, I don't know whether there is a gun in their house, and I don't know whether this is high or low, but 50% of them think that there's a gun in their house. How optimistic are these kids about the future? This is factoid 9. 7 in 10 of them will think that they'll be mugged at some time. I mean, this is an incredible number. I mean, their likelihood of getting mugged is not very great. They're much more likely to get the flu than get mugged, but they think they have a 7 in 10 chance of getting mugged. Similarly, 5 in 10 of them report that most people in power cannot be trusted. In this, I must say, they're not very much different than adults or more grown-up adults. About 50% of adult surveys respond that they don't trust people in power either. Predicting and preventing school violence is a major part of protecting kids and getting them to a safe adulthood.
In my other life, before I joined with Gavin Becker, I was with the Los Angeles Police Department for 28 years. Most of that was in detectives and most of that was in the command level. And in 1990, I had the opportunity to put together a threat management unit, which was the first of its kind in the country. And I wanted to share with you a little about what was going on before then, because that was kind of a seminal thing in the areas of threat management, and I wanted to give you a little brief history of how some of that came about. Because in the 1970s, threat assessment wasn't done poorly, because it wasn't being done at all, really. There were police agencies that had intelligence units, and they did a lot of that type of analysis, but it wasn't the kind of things that we're talking here today. And through that decade, things were changing, and as we moved into the 1980s, there were people working on changing that. People like Gavin Becker and Dr. Park Dietz and Dr. Walt Ressler and Dr. Monahan out of Virginia. We're all looking at ways to predict violence and ways to assess it. But as they shared information and as things began to come together, they started to realize that an organized approach to these things had some merit. And at the same time, as all of this was developing, much behind the scenes, in 1989, Captain Bob Donnelly and Sergeant Steve Weston of the California State Police, which was the unit responsible for managing the governor's security, were looking for more effective ways to manage the caseload that they had. And simultaneously, I was looking for ways. I was a commanding officer of LAPD's Detective Headquarters Division at the time. And I was looking for ways because we had such a volume of things that were occurring. And we were looking for better ways to make predictions work. And we were seeking to solve some of the similar problems. But when the state police first approached Gavin, they had an interesting slant to it because they made it very clear that they weren't interested in hiring his services. They were interested in the method and the process that went behind it. And in my conversations with them, I started to realize there was some sense to that too. But my path to this was a little bit different because one of the units that worked for me at that time was a mental evaluation unit that did what the name would suggest and triaged the mentally ill that came into police custody. And the detective in charge of that unit, a fellow by the name of Walter DeCure, had identified a group of people, mentally ill people, that we now know and love as stalkers. And in his research into this new arena, this was new. He ran across some of the names that I told you, one of which was Gavin Becker, and he came to me and said, "You need to meet this fellow." And being a good, incestuous LAPD thinker, I said, "Why would I want to meet with some civilian? What could they possibly teach me?" Well, Walter was smarter than I was and was persistent, and I agreed to meet with this Becker character for about 15 minutes was all I could spare. But that 15-minute meeting lasted a couple of hours. And I really couldn't believe some of the things that I was hearing. I didn't know what to do with them at the time, but it sounded interesting, and I knew there was a place for it somewhere in law enforcement. Then in 1989, in that same year, Rebecca Schaefer was murdered. and put stalking and inappropriate pursuit on the front page of every paper in the country. And from that was born a new way of looking at life. But what had happened was that some agents for celebrities in the Hollywood area put together a personal protection seminar, drew 600 people to it, and they invited a speaker from the FBI and a speaker from the Los Angeles Police Department, me and Gavin Becker, and Park Dietz contributed to that. Well, the fellow from the FBI got up and talked for 5 minutes and very adeptly said, "There isn't anything we can do to help you." He said it nicely. Well, as again, being from LAPD and always not wanting to pass up the opportunity to outdo the FBI, I took 6 minutes to say the same thing. "We can't help you." And Gavin got up and talked for an hour and a half. I'm going, there's something here. In the question and answer period, the questions certainly to the FBI and to me were, well, why don't you do something? Obviously the technology exists, obviously the methods are there, obviously the research is there, why don't you do something? My answer was, I don't know. But from that meeting, I made the decision because I said, well, what I did is when Gavin offered to donate us his computer program, the Mosaic program, in 1989, I said to the group, I don't have the computer to put it on, thinking that would get me out of it. And a fellow in the audience stood up and says, well, if that's all that's keeping you from doing it, I'll buy your computer for you. I go, damn. Hung by the tongue, as they say. Well, I went back, and from that was born LAPD's Threat Management Unit. I went back to then Deputy Chief Bernard Parks, who's now the Chief of Police, and told him my ideas for this, and he said, do it. And that was a bold step in 1989. For those of you who followed LAPD's history, there was a lot of pressure on them for intelligence files and monitoring individuals that weren't committing crimes. But he was willing to take that step because it involved us inquiring into and looking into the lives of people who had yet committed no crime. There were no stalking laws on the books at that time. There were no terrorist threats. There were no people that we could do anything, or no ways that we could do anything with people that made those kind of comments. But we did it. And all he said was, you can't have any equipment, cars, or people, but make it happen. Some of you know that line? Well, we did it. We found some detectives who weren't working as hard as they thought they were, and we reorganized it, and we got in business. Well, shortly after, and almost at the same time, shortly after that, Bill Zimmerman, detective with the U.S. Capitol Police, came on board. And he came to me and to Gavin and said, we need to do this too. And Dennis Chapless from the U.S. Supreme Court came on and said, we need a way too. And the common factor that we all had in all of this was that we were handling large numbers, very large numbers of very inappropriate communications and threats to innocent people. And we all knew we had to do something, and it all came together. And many of the people who have since adopted these kinds of methods and processes or ways to learn from an organized, systematic approach to threat assessment are in this room today, which raises another interesting point, and it's one that I hope you won't lose, that not all of the experts in this area are coming up to this stage today. Many of them are sitting next to you. Find out who's here. We have a cross-section of people here today that is incredible. The talent and the expertise in this room is amazing. And later on today, when we get into interactive groups, you will understand that, and we certainly would seek your participation. And the events of the last year have made it very clear that there is a need for such a systematized approach within the school systems. It's existed elsewhere for a long time. And by the end of the day, I think it will be equally clear to all of you that the same technologies that high-volume, high-stakes predictions have been made under over the last several years in law enforcement agencies, large corporations, and large universities is equally applicable to the high school and middle school campuses. And our mission basically is to make it happen. Now, I've synthesized 20 years of evolutionary history of threat assessment into 9 minutes because today isn't about the past. Today is about the future. And that is what we're going to be focusing on for the rest of the day, the future and the future of our children. I have a video clip to show you.
We have been talking to the Brown family about the nightmare they went through at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado. Joining us is Gavin Becker, one of America's leading experts on predicting violence. He has advised the Supreme Court, the CIA, many notable private citizens in his new book, Protecting the Gift, Keeping Children and Teenagers Safe.
You take a Kip Kinkle case that you referred to in the brief video that you did. Here's a kid who gives the ultimate pre-incident indicator he brings a gun to school the day before the attack. He is arrested for it. He is taken to the police department. And what do? They return him to his father, the man who gave him the 2 guns in the first place. It doesn't seem like it was the best alternative. He was also on medication like Eric Harris was. He was also obsessed with these video games like Eric Harris was. He was also talking about pipe bombs. He was also surfing the web for information about violence. And, you know, I saw the Time magazine cover that said "The Monsters Next Door."
Yeah.
And that's a very disappointing cover to read.
Yeah, I thought so, too.
These are 2 boys.
2 boys.
And many factors come together to cause this.
And you know what? And by making them monsters, and everybody can say, not my kid.
That's right. We've got a country with more guns than adults. Each one of those guns we make every 12 seconds in America has a shelf life.
We have more guns than adults?
Yes. And each gun has a shelf life of 400 years. So the fact that we're making 18,000 of them a day, and each one lasts for 400 years, ought to be telling that these boys have a menu of choices in their lives that even I didn't have just 20 years ago in my life, a menu of opportunities, and some of them involve violence. Well, these kids have grown up with death in a way that you and I never did. They are so comfortable with shooting, with, you see these video games, brains that blow up, and movies. Look, the most promoted image in the United States of America for the last 10 weeks, and in the weeks prior to Littleton, is of Keanu Reeves standing in a black trench coat with automatic weapons around his waist. This is their world. Because it's a tragedy for the people in Littleton, no question. It need not be a tragedy for this society if we use this to learn.
Please help me welcome Gavin to Becker.
Thank you very much. Barbara, I learned something from you that I didn't know, that the brain development continues and doesn't really get finished until 35. And that is also the exact same time that all sexual functioning stops. So for any of you who are under 35, you may not be as smart, but you are having all the fun. There's another group that we're joined by here today, and that is teenagers. We have a group of teenagers from a few school systems around the country. Can you raise your hands, those of you who fall in that category? Okay, great. Thank you for coming. You are appropriately, it's appropriate that you're represented here, and it means a lot that you are taking the time to join us to discuss these things. We are not going to talk about teenagers as if they are monsters and perpetrators. These are choices that we, adults in this society, are giving to kids. And these are behaviors that we are allowing in one form or another. I remember when I was 14 years old in high school, there was a boy in my class named Cliff, and he was in the gym class that I had, and he was in a couple of other classes, and he had very rosy pink cheeks and straight black hair. And I remember that he walked with his hands down by his side all the time. He didn't swing his arms like the rest of the people. And he moved awkwardly, and he rarely spoke, and he kept to himself. Or at least he would have if we had let him. We mercilessly picked on this boy, and I was good at it. I was not the lead tormentor, but I was the number 2 tormentor out of a group that eventually grew to be the whole class. The lead tormentor was an athletic kid named Peter, good-looking kid. And Cliff would never defend himself no matter what we said to him, and he never fought back, and he took abuse as if he were born for the job. And eventually the whole class joined in, and he could never arrive at class without jeers of, here's the queer, here's the fag, here's the wimp, nice makeup, nice rouge, we used to say to him. And if he responded in any way, if he said cut it out, that would just encourage more abuse on our part. And if he didn't respond, then Peter, the most athletic boy, would usually start to hit or shove him, and he would not respond in any way. His passive red face would get a little bit redder, but that's all he would do. Never push Peter back. And this went on for about 6 months until Cliff eventually started adding a new wrinkle to his response, and that is that he would just grin when somebody would say something bad to him. And intuitively, I knew that it was time to drop out of the group of boys that was picking on Cliff. And I decided to do that. And while they competitively thought of new insulting names for him, I just watched. And I wasn't going to go so far as to become his friend, of course, but I had a couple of conversations with him that were civil. And around this time, I had slipped and broken my leg on the steps at home, and I was in a cast for 6 weeks. And during those 6 weeks, I got to stand outside the group and watch while the other kids were in gym class and watch the way we treated Cliff. And it was a good lesson for me. I was very glad, and I'm still glad that I had that opportunity. And over those weeks, I saw a lot. I remember there was a stack of white towels in the gym, in the shower room, and a couple of them were sort of pink, and they would always be sure that Cliff got those pink towels, and they would throw it to him and say, "Here, Cliff, here's your towel," and he would just grin, and then a group of boys would pull his shirt away from him, and they would toss it around, and they would yell, "Fag rag," and then nobody would want to touch the shirt, but they wouldn't let him near the shirt in the middle of the room, and he just grinned. And one day somebody brought a woman's bathing cap to school, and it was light blue and was decorated with plastic flowers on it, and they held Cliff down and they forced that onto his head, and he just grinned. And in the school weight room, though a lot of the exercises required 2 boys to do them, nobody would partner with him, so he was often out of the group. And I remember the day very well that everybody stopped picking on him. We were in that weight room, and 2 boys were searching for a steel rod that was part of a set that you'd use to hold up the weight bar. It was something shaped like this, and the weight bar would go across it. And without that steel rod, they couldn't do the bench presses. And everybody was looking for that, and I was on a cast, and I was sort of hobbling around trying to help find it. And after a while, everybody else gave up searching for that rod, but for some reason I was intent on finding it. And I remember Peter was at the far corner of the room, and he was doing sit-ups on one of those inclined slant boards. So his head was down low and he was doing sit-ups. And something was not right, I knew. Something I saw out of the corner of my eye, and I heard myself yell out the name, "Cliff, Cliff," real loud. I didn't know why. And as I turned, he was standing above that slant board, and that missing steel rod was in his hand above his head. And he might have heard me yell out his name, I don't know, but he sure wasn't distracted. And that steel rod was already on its way down into Peter's face, where that collision turned the handsome into the gruesome. And he raised his hand one more time, and he hit it one more time with the steel rod in the head. And having injured him severely, Cliff calmly put down that steel rod and just grinned. And both boys were taken away. Peter by ambulance, of course, to be seen about 3 months later, badly disfigured as he is today. And Cliff was taken away by police, never to be seen by us again. I have no idea where he is. And almost 30 years have passed since Peter and the rest of us received the consequences for taunting a boy who was secretly seething. Now you move that story to current times and add one of those 2,000 guns that we build every hour of every business day, and you have Kip Kinkle attacking kids at his school. No question in my mind that Cliff would have preferred to use a handgun over that steel rod. Now Kip Kinkle, the shooter up in Springfield, Oregon, and we have some people here from the community right near Springfield who are taking a much stronger approach to this topic than Springfield was able to before the shootings. Kip Kinkle had filled out an application for his internet service, and he listed his profession as a student surfing the web for info on how to build bombs. And he made threats to kill everyone. And he bragged about killing animals, and he gave a speech at school on how to build a pipe bomb. And all that bravado was to cover the hurt and shame of being teased by classmates. And many people knew a piece of the puzzle in the Kip Kinkle case, but nobody saw or understood or believed enough of the pieces to bring that image into focus. You don't need all the pieces of the puzzle before you can see what something is. Believing that any human behavior is possible is a necessary feature. We all need it in order to make effective predictions. Remember, it is not the eye that sees these details, it is the mind. And something must be in the mind first in order to give the meaning to what the eye observes. So we here have to be willing to believe, willing to know that human beings do these things, not monsters. And that like every creature on earth, we human beings can predict human behavior. A lot of people think that's not possible. After Kip Kinkle's shooting, a lot of principals around the country said, hey, we get thousands of threats. We can never tell the difference between the ones that are likely to be acted upon and the ones that are not. And I want to work with you to change people's minds about that, because in fact the kids who act out violently do behave in ways that are demonstrably different from the other kids. And it may mean that we sometimes identify a kid as being at risk of acting out violently who never intended to and never would, but that kid still needs some help. His behavior still requires some intervention and attention. Now, I said that every creature on earth can predict violent behavior, and human beings are no different. Imagine two wolves coming together in the forest one night, and they face each other, and one of them shows his teeth, and his ears go back flat, and he digs his back paws into the ground, and he attacks the other wolf. Well, you cannot imagine that the victim says, "Oh my God, I had no idea that was coming." They have exchanged a series of signals then, just like every animal in nature does, and so do we. There is a big propensity in the local news media to say that people who go on shooting sprees just snapped or went berserk. Well, just snapped is something that I want to tell you never, ever happens with human beings. It is a process as observable as water coming to a boil, if you know what to look for and if you are in a position to receive the details. Now, perhaps anybody here, there may be people here who imagine that they could never get frustrated enough, or desperate enough, or lonely enough, or lose their identity enough to actually kill the way some of these boys have killed. But the fact is, you can imagine every human feeling, and it is that ability which makes you an expert at predicting what other people will do. I recall so many news stories where a father kills his kids and his wife and then himself. And what do the neighbors say? "I can't imagine a father doing that." Well, if you can't imagine it, you can't predict it. And how many times would we have to see that news story to know that when a whole family is killed, who do you suppose did it if not someone in the family? How frequently in our history do we recall an entire family being killed that it wasn't someone in the family doing it? It's extremely rare. So I want to leave you today knowing that you can imagine every human feeling. You want to know how to stop violently inclined children, and I do too. Well, since you know all about human beings, then this expedition today begins and ends in familiar territory. You have been attending your academy of predicting violent behavior your whole lives. And to pick up your diploma in predicting violence, there is just one truth that you must accept, and that is that there is no mystery of human behavior that cannot be solved inside your head or your heart. We're not talking today about Japanese river toads. We'll be talking about human beings, and all of us know what it's like to be outside a group, and all of us know what it's like to be very, very angry, and all of us know what it's like to be near the edge of our tolerance level for someone else's behavior. Imagine the life of one of these boys. In my new book, I've got a wonderful thing. There's a woman named Dr. Mary Arneson. I say it's a wonderful thing. I didn't write it. I gave her 20 pages of the book to describe her childhood experience. Picked on. She was a mildly autistic girl, picked on by everybody else in the class. She wore colorful tennis shoes. The other kids didn't wear those, needless to say. And she said it took little effort for the girls to call her at home and ask, "Where do you get those beautiful shoes?" And she would dutifully answer, not knowing that she was preparing them, arming them for 2 years of abuse on that subject. That the girls asking, "Where did you get those beautiful shoes?" were actually giggling all up their ears up against the phone. Or the boy who said to her, "Another boy has a crush on you, you ought to go ask him out." So that she went to the football player in the school, the star of the school, this awkward, tall, gawky, geeky, tennis-shoed girl went to him and asked him on a date. And you can be sure that that became the source of great humor for the school year. Now, a lot of people insist that they could never get angry enough to be violent. And invariably, at a talk like this, somebody will stand up and say, "I could never kill anyone." Usually a timid woman will say, "I could never kill anyone. I could never do that." And if I'm just quiet, she will always add a very telling caveat. She will say, "Unless someone tried to hurt my children." Then this timid woman could bite, scratch, rip, shoot, stab, burn, and she'd want to. She'd be fighting to get across the room to do those things. So that resource of violence is in everyone. And all that changes between you and me, and Kip Kinkle and you and me, and Robert Bardo and you and me, all that changes is our view of the justification. That is really the only difference. There isn't a single one of these boys that acted out violently who thought he had no reason to do so, just as there isn't a single soldier anywhere in the world who kills someone else and thinks he has no reason to do so. A young man, for example, kills a cow with an axe and then climbs inside the carcass to see what it's like. And later he uses that same axe to kill his 8-year-old stepbrother. Extraordinarily bizarre behavior. Or another young man murders an actress who was kind to him. Or another young man murders his parents by shooting out their eyes with a shotgun. And we use the word inhuman to describe these murderers. But I know them all personally, and they are not inhuman. They are, in fact, precisely human. They did things no other animal in nature would even consider doing. I know their parents and the parents of their victims, and their violent acts, I will grant you, are repugnant and objectionable and wrong, but they are not inhuman. And when we accept this, we are then more likely to recognize the spousal abuser at work, or the rapist who tries to con his way into an apartment, or the pedophile who befriends our child, or the boy who takes a gun to high school. We will see him more clearly when we accept that he is us. When we accept that violence is committed by people who look and act exactly like people. That's when we silence the voice of denial that always whispers to a school principal somewhere in America this very week. It will whisper, "This kid doesn't look like a killer." Now, all of this brings me to the subject of intuition, because intuition is the system that nature has provided us to protect ourselves. Intuition is knowing without knowing why. The root of the word, by the way, intuition, is inter, and that means to guard and to protect. That's what intuition is meant to do. It is knowing without consciously seeing all the evidence. It's that feeling that every one of you has had at some time in life that leads you to take an action. It's the intuitive feeling that a teacher or a principal has that leads them to suspect that a child is being abused at home and take action. I was that child. I know it very well, and I know the value of it. I did not go to school wearing a sandwich sign that said, "Help me." Someone had to be intuitive enough to hear that and see that. Now, for a lot of people, and unfortunately for a lot of us working in the criminal justice field, it's hard to accept the importance of intuition because we've gotten addicted to grounded, logical facts. In fact, we look upon intuition sometimes with contempt, and it's described as emotional, and it's described as unreasonable or inexplicable. Husbands chide their wives about feminine intuition, and we roll our eyes when a woman goes down that road and we don't take it seriously. When women discuss intuition, we write it off. We much prefer logic, the explainable, unemotional, the thought process that ends in a supportable conclusion. In fact, Americans worship logic even when it's wrong. And we deny intuition even when it's right. You can't explain to your boss that you did something that worked out well just because you felt it was the right thing to do. You got to show him why. That's what makes you smart. You can't use your feelings. And by the same token, you can't use as an excuse when something works out badly, it was just a feeling. Now you've got to show him the logical reasons you took steps A through Z, and he says, you know, it didn't work out, but that's okay, at least you had good reasons. We'd actually prefer, when things don't go well, and we can support it with logic, than to ever have to look at a group of people and say, I did this just because I felt it was right. Now, women have that feminine intuition. We men have something a little bit different. Ours is much more important and significant. It's called a gut feeling. And it's got that good visceral name. But neither of these things is really just a feeling. The human brain is nature's greatest accomplishment, and intuition is the nuclear defense system. But why don't we always use it? Because on the other side of intuition, there's denial. And denial is what helps us not see things that are right in front of us. You know, we will all say, somehow I knew, about that chance meeting that we had, that we predicted we would have. I thought I'd run into you today. Or that phone call from a distant friend that came out of nowhere, supposedly. I knew it would be you. Or we'll say, somehow I knew about the violence we steered clear of. Or the violence just as often that we failed to steer clear of. Somehow I knew. Like the Brown family that you saw a little piece of on that Oprah Winfrey show, like they knew that Eric Harris was going to go on a killing spree at school. Was it hard for them to know it? Was it hard for Mrs. Brown to believe it so strongly that she told Eric, you stay away from my son? Was it hard for her to believe it so strongly that she made 2 trips to the sheriff's department to tell them about her concerns about Eric Harris? Or hard for her to believe it so strongly that she got someone to come to their home and show them what pipe bombs look like because she was concerned that Eric Harris would put a pipe bomb at their home? Well, let's look at how hard it was for her to apply those intuitive feelings. Many of you have probably never heard what I'm going to share with you about information written on Eric Harris's website. A bit has been publicized. But among the things that Mrs. Brown read on Eric Harris's website was this, quote, "We haven't decided what to do or where to do it, but we intend to go to Wyoming and load up on that stuff. We still need to get the fuses, too." And he wrote, "All I want to do is kill and injure as many of you pricks as I can. I'll go to some downtown area and I'll blow up and shoot everything I can. Feel no remorse, no sense of shame. I don't care. And I don't care if I live or die in the shootout." Easy to explain away. Kids do that all the time, don't they? But he didn't just write about it. He had set off at least 3 pipe bombs in his neighborhood. And he had threatened to kill Brooks Brown, Mrs. Brown's son. And the Browns told everything I just told you to the police, who chose not to go and interview Eric or his parents. It is not my intent now to criticize them. They didn't believe it was serious. If they believed it, they'd have acted differently, I know. But they didn't. But it does lead me to something. Denial is not just a river in Africa. When Jonesboro happened, Mrs. Brown called the detective again, and she said, "It's going to happen here. Are you investigating this matter?" Now, I mentioned that intuition is knowing something without seeing all the evidence. Denial is seeing all the evidence and choosing not to know. It is something only human beings do in nature. There is no other animal that does it. Imagine an animal, even the bravest animal, a lion, is walking through the jungle, and it hears a noise that causes fear. Gets that fear feeling. Do you think that lion says, "Oh, it's probably nothing"? But we do that all the time, all the time. A woman is waiting for an elevator in a closed building late at night, and the doors open up, and she looks inside, and there's a man who causes her fear. She's afraid of the man in the elevator. It doesn't matter why. The way he looks at her, the way he's dressed, it doesn't matter why. What does she do? She says, "I don't want to live like that. I don't want to be the kind of person who lets the door close in his face. I certainly don't want to insult him." And so she gets into a steel, soundproofed chamber with someone she's afraid of. Is there another animal in nature that would even consider doing something like that? There's the risk. I'll go toward that. We're the only ones that do it. Now, I've talked about intuition. Imagine the intuitive wisdom in this room. You each have read, heard, experienced, reviewed, learned, and relearned much, much more than you know. And your intuition is so well informed on this topic that it's brilliant. And one of the things we want to do today is capture some of that, organize some of that. Every child you ever worked with, every case you ever worked or heard about or imagined, it's all in that computer, in your intuitive computer. Every experience you had yourself as a teenager, every pain you felt as a teenager, every interest you had in a handgun if you were a teenage boy, every revulsion you had from a handgun if you were a teenage girl. It's all in there. Now later we're going to look at artificial intuition, and we'll try to organize some of the intuitive wisdom in this room. To show you something about intuition, I want to do a little exercise. I'm going to show you some intuitive word puzzles. They are puzzles that use letters to express famous people's names, famous book titles, movie titles, phrases, expressions, sayings, places. And I'm going to put these up on the screen, and I just ask you to call out loudly if you get one. Call it out fast, because there will be a competition. Somebody in this room will want to distinguish him or herself as the best at these intuitive word puzzles. Now, you'll notice an interesting thing will happen. If we're about evenly divided between men and women, you will notice, as I have, doing this all over the country, that women will call out the majority of the correct answers. Now, before the women feel too proud about that, I have to explain that women will also call out the majority of the incorrect answers. And that's because women are willing to call out anything. Now, the men in the room, they won't get as many, because while the women are trying their best to get them, the men will each be doing their personal logic test, and they're sure as hell not going to stand up and say, Robert Redford is the solution to that puzzle, until they know it 15 ways to China. They will not take a chance. So what I encourage the men in this room to do is to let go of that, and if you get one of these and you think you've got it, just yell out whatever comes into your head. If a man in this room calls out one that's wrong, I will praise him, because he'll have proven that he's willing to use that more feminine resource. So I'm going to put these up on the screen. There's a few of you in this room who have done these already. You will be cheating if you participate. And so I'll put these up on the screen, and just call out loud if you get one of these. What's that? All right. I'm going to show you this one so you see what these are. They're not acronyms. They're not a matter of rearranging the words or the letters. This one is rate increase, because rate is increase. Rate increase. If you are moaning about that one, folks, I'll give you something to really moan about, as parents often say. Here you go. What's that? Woman first. Thank you. I'm hearing more women's voices than men up here. Great. Social Security Administration. Who said it? It's wrong. But you were willing to say it, and that's good. Ass backwards is the correct one. But you're going to do 10 times better than most people here today, really. That's very good. You've just given me a line to steal for my next talk. Thank you. He says ass backwards and Social Security is the same thing. That's very good. Okay, what's this one? Button your lip. Thank you, ma'am. Who said it? Now, you've gotten a few of these, and I want to tell you that this skill that you have is absolutely useless. If you're really good at these, this is the only room you'll ever get in where it's an asset. Tennis-anyone is correct. Ten-is-any-one. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. Or am I wrong? All right. Who said it? Great. Thank you. Psychology, reverse psychology. Yes, reverse psychology is correct.
4 and 1.
Who said 4 and 1? Okay, it's wrong, but that's good.
An eye for an eye?
An eye for an eye is correct. An eye for an eye. That's the literal rule. Say it loud. Okay, 2 peas in a pod that's correct. Scott, you've seen these so many times, you must just be sitting on your hands. Okay. A river runs through it is correct. Is correct. For an enemy is correct. This one I can get a drink on, it's hard. What? Wow, equatorial region, no, but... Foreign Legion. What kind of Foreign Legion? French Foreign Legion is correct. Okay. What's that? Truth in Advertising is correct. What's that? Four Seasons Hotel is correct. Yep. I want to tell you my experience from up here. What starts sporadically, now the whole room calls out. And this is a good example. All that's changed between the first puzzle and this puzzle is that you believe you can solve them. If the first puzzle was, if we sat for 20 minutes looking at the first one, that would not be encouraging. But the thing is that your intuitive resource, you'll get some of these and not even know that you got them. You won't even know how you got it. What's that? That's correct. T for 2 and 2 for T. I can take a drink on this one. What? Mm-mm. But it's good to see you get one wrong. What is it? No? It's good. Am I going to finish this entire drink in the time we're waiting for this one? What kind of drink? Mixed drink is correct. Mixed drink. What's that? What's that? Shrinking deficit. What's that? Chief Inspector is correct. That? When in Rome is correct. Two more. Captain Hook is correct. L10 John is correct. And the last one. Why is it Robert De Niro? Who said Robert De Niro? You did? Who said it down here? Why is it Robert De Niro? And this is interesting. You got it right and you don't know why. That's it. The D is near the O. Is that moaning? All right. That, by the way, may be the last laughing we do today, so I hope it was enjoyable. I want to talk about these phrases that we use out of the blue, saying these boys did this out of the blue, all of a sudden, out of nowhere. These are phrases that human beings use to support the popular myth that human behavior cannot be predicted. A lot of people believe that. And yet think about it. To get here this morning, all of you who drove successfully navigated through traffic by making amazingly accurate and amazingly high-stakes predictions about people you never saw before in your life. From 100 yards away, the little tilt of a stranger's head was unconsciously read by you, or the sustained look of a person in a car crossing an intersection tells you that it's okay to pass in front of his 2-ton monster. These are high-stakes predictions we make all the time. They may be the highest-stakes predictions any of us ever make. While we're driving to work thinking about the important business at work, we're in the most important business of our day. So here we are, traveling along faster than anyone before the 1900s traveled in any direction, except down, if they were falling off something. And we're dodging these giant high-momentum steel missiles and judging the intent of their operators with fantastic accuracy, and then arriving at work and saying, well, you can't predict human behavior. You can. We predict with some success how a child will react to a warning. That's why we warn him. Or how a consumer will react to a slogan. That's why Procter & Gamble spends $1 billion a year with slogans. Or how a spouse will react to a comment. All of you know how to start a fight. We predict how a witness will react to a question and how a jury will react to a witness. And predicting violent behavior is easier than all of those. Because predicting violent behavior is a prediction of gross action that requires a great investment on the part of the person who does it, that carries great consequences. People don't do it lightly. And yet, even with everything I just said, we fantasize that human violence is an aberration that is done by others unlike ourselves, so we cannot predict it. A lot of people believe that you can't predict violent behavior. There isn't a police officer in this room who believes that, but a lot of people believe it. When animals are violent, we've got it all figured out. We say it's territorialism, or it's something to do with mating, or it's population control. We understand the cause and the purpose of violence by every single creature on earth except ourselves. And groups like ours today, like all of you, can help change that. And we have to do it for the reasons Barbara said, the reasons you already came into the room knowing. There are some reasons you may not know. Today in America, the leading cause of death to teenage boys is gunshot wounds. Black, white, urban, suburban. That is the leading cause of death. When all of us were kids, it was car accidents, of course, but what happened? Cars got safer, and guns got more dangerous, and more of them. Mark Twain, who wrote every boy's favorite book about boyhood, wrote an essay in 1923, and he called guns in the hands of the young, quote, the most deadly and unerring things that have ever been created by man. You don't even have to have sights on it. You don't even have to take aim. No, you just pick out a relative and bang away, and you are sure to get him. And he speculated rather brilliantly that the most effective army in the world would be comprised of young boys who'd found an old gun in the house that they thought wasn't loaded, because, said Twain, they never miss. And his point has been proved by boys with guns 10,000 times over, 100,000 times over, 2,000 times just this year in America alone. Not 2 boys at Littleton, not a third at Atlanta, but 2,000 boys who killed someone with a gun this year in America. Now, I talk a lot about guns as a key element in these problems, and they are a key element. That's not all we'll be talking about today, of course. And I have likely offended, unintentionally, some gun advocates. Could it be that in America we have a kind of person called a gun advocate? Republicans and Democrats and gun advocates. But nonetheless, we have them. People who are proud to stand up and say, I'm one of them. My issue is not gun control, and certainly not government gun control. If anything, it would be personal gun control. My issue today is gun access. That's the issue we need to explore. But because I've said some nasty things about guns, and because the statistics themselves are fairly nasty, I want to say some praising things about firearms, and it's easy for me to do, in part because the male brain is hardwired to like guns. And that fact may be of interest to any woman who's ever been perplexed by the love affair that we men have with these loud, dangerous metal objects. Why do we? Well, it starts with a difference in our brains. And no one here doubts that our brains are different, men and women. There's a bundle of nerves called the corpus callosum. It connects the right and the left brain. It is larger by far in females than it is in males. And for that reason, women enjoy a lot more crosstalk between the left and the right brain. And that dialogue brings women many benefits. For example, women have greater reading skills. They excel at empathy and understanding facial expressions much more than men do. They retain more of what they read. They are far more attuned to their environment. Put a man in front of a television show, he's out. He might as well be in Spain. But a woman can still function in that environment. She can still see the activities that are going on around her. A man is tremendously focused. And men, oblivious to a whole lot of left brain matters, because we don't have that great big nerve bundle right in the middle of our brain, we are focused on right brain matters, like spatial relationships. That's our thing. We are the great architects and the great engineers of the species. I'm a feminist, but you will not produce for me a whole list of the world's greatest engineers and architects who are women. Do they exist? Absolutely. But that is not where women have made their mark. Men are built to enjoy and be drawn to spatial relationships. Look at all our games. You give us a football field, we will fill it up with something interesting. And football is interesting in particular because it challenges the male brain to do the thing it's best at, and that is to hone our skill at moving objects through space. That's what we like doing. Cars, jets, missiles, and nothing moves objects through space more impressively than a gun moves a bullet. That's one reason we love them. And there's another reason, more impressive than that. The gun brought a feature to hunting that revolutionized our species. It would appeal to any creature. It is the utter safety of distance. The gun became our lowest risk hunting tool. You didn't have to get up there and stick and stab and twist and risk. We could take on the most dangerous animal, defeat any defense system, while leaving the hunter totally free of personal risk because of the gun. With gun in hand, man declared victory in the evolutionary battle of the species. And today, having beaten down every other creature on Earth, the gun has transformed lethal conflict between humans, particularly if your adversary doesn't have one. Animals always risk injury when they use violence. Only we do not. And that makes violence much more attractive to us. Even now, in the war that just ended, if it has, in Kosovo, we could use violence with no consequences whatsoever. You and I went to dinner, we went to movies, big movies opened, big national events happened, concerts happened. We didn't feel this war at all. And we focused on Littleton, while 8,000 miles away, individual bombs were killing that number of people in a millisecond. Those television studios that we see blown up, there's 1,300 people in those buildings. When you can exercise violence without consequences, man does. It's been proven throughout our species. Now let's look at the boys. They too can exercise violence without consequences that are unfavorable because they view the consequences as favorable. I'll be famous. I'll have an identity. I'll be tough. I'll be the dominant male. Those are all good selling points, particularly when you can't turn on the television without seeing Littleton again and again and again and again. Boys made that happen, not men. The SWAT team disabled by boys. The school disabled by boys. Now, I mentioned that animals always risk injury when they attack. So they have to carefully evaluate using violence, animals do. Is he larger, their adversary? Is he stronger? Is he faster? With the gun, none of that matters anymore. The scrawniest male, me, at 5'9", can prevail over the mightiest male. In effect, this distorts one of nature's ranking systems. And that's the reason the gun is called the great equalizer. Because of guns, we can kill anything with no risk, and it is little wonder that we love them. Shot from the porch at some tin cans, or shot from an aircraft carrier at some Iraqis, we love guns. And so while you may be able to keep your teenage son Jimmy from owning a gun, if you try to talk him out of wanting one or being interested, you are up against some pretty extensive odds. He's got a strong argument. Hey, Mom, you mean I shouldn't want a device that grants me power and identity, makes me feel dangerous and safe at the same time, instantly makes me the dominant male, and connects me to my evolutionary essence? Get real, Mom. And when Jimmy enters his teens, then 1 million cells swimming in testosterone will stir these mysterious male cravings that call out one word: dominate. Because that's how you get the good chicks. So are we curious about guns? We boys, curiosity doesn't even get near it. We are enraptured by guns. On the news, on TV, on a shelf in the attic, at a movie, at a toy store, at a friend's house, in a magazine, in a video game, in the bedside drawer. You cannot keep it from us. And the gun industry does not need the NRA to promote guns to boys. It does not need Charlton Heston to promote guns to boys. It's already done by nature. It's interesting that our country knows more about why someone buys a particular brand of shaving lotion than about why he buys a gun. And considering that so many parents have made the choice to have guns available to their teenagers, it's no wonder that the rate of firearms deaths for the young in America is 12 times higher than in all the other industrialized nations combined. That's our circumstance. That's where our sons live. So protecting teenage boys from violence and protecting other teenagers from their violence and keeping them from guns amounts to almost the same thing. I do not want to hear another argument on the local news about how even if you keep them from guns, they can still build bombs, which has happened all of one time in a substantial school shooting. And not one bomb killed anyone at Littleton. But I want to acknowledge, as I move off guns, that there is another thing we have to keep our teenage boys away from, and that is dangerous friends. Because the key that unlocks a boy's destructiveness is often held by another boy. The 1998 case of the two boys in Jonesboro, Arkansas, they shot 15 people at their school. It involves one boy inciting another, 11 years old, Drew Golden, and 13 years old, Mitch Johnson. And they had little in common with each other until they became famous killers. For example, Santa Claus gave Drew a shotgun when he was 6, but Mitch was never allowed to have a gun in his house. Drew was taught to hunt as a tot, and he later perfected his reflexes with violent video games, but Mitch's family would not let him play those games and wouldn't pay for them. Drew wore military fatigues to school. Mitch wore choir robes and sang in a Baptist church. Drew talked about taking over the school, and Mitch got A's in lots of subjects, and he made the basketball team, the football team, and the baseball team. When they wanted guns, they went to Drew's house, not Mitch's house, because guns were banned in Mitch's house. And to his credit, Drew's father had a gun vault that the boys could not open. To his discredit, the boys were still able to find 3 handguns unsecured. And they got 7 more guns from Drew's grandfather's house. Now, both these boys had problems, to be sure, but based on what I've just told you and what you know about these cases, does it seem likely to anyone in this room that Mitch Johnson would have gone on a shooting spree at his school without Drew's influence? I don't think so. And I feel the same way about Dylan Klebold and Eric Harris. But understand something. Teenagers will try anything. That is the role that teenagers play in our species. They go out and try anything. They'll eat anything. They'll test anything. You couldn't get a bear or a wolf to jump off the top of a waterfall, but you take a teenage boy there and he'll look over and think, I'll try it. And proving this decisively, that teenage boys are followers of more charismatic leaders. Remember that throughout human history, mankind has used teenage boys to do its killing and to fight its wars. It's even harder for one boy to get another boy to violence if that boy has an effective social support system, parents who listen, parents who see what's going on. But it is really easy to get one boy to be violent if they share justification in the form of a common enemy. Those boys who pick on them are the common enemy. Those schools that don't do anything about it are the common enemy. Understand that when teenagers today get their first job at McDonald's, all of a sudden they can't call somebody a fag at work. All of a sudden they can't say fatty to somebody. All of a sudden they can't call someone ugly or make fun of their complexion. They're not allowed to. McDonald's says no. That behavior is no good here. So how in the world do we allow this in high school? We do it because of one sentence that everyone in America has heard at one time or another. Well, kids are cruel. No shit. Kids are cruel. Adults are cruel. But we don't let it go on here. There are 10 words I could say in this room that would lead us into litigation, for God's sake. And yet teenage boys can say them, and the teenage kids who are here today hear them all the time. And the kids at Littleton heard them all the time. So it's one of the things we'll want to look at today when we talk about the intervention strategies and the prevention strategies, is do we want to begin to apply a standard of behavior in school that we've applied at every other place that our children go and at every other place that we will go as adults? Is high school training teenagers to live in society? It doesn't sound like it. In a few ways it is, because last year 1 million kids carried a gun to school. 1 million kids, ages grades 6 to 12. Now, most of the boys who are picked on are alone. I talked about 2 cases where they work together. But I talked about it to say that if a teenage boy is surrounded by 1 or more boys who are like-minded with their fascination with violence, video games, movies, threats, guns, rejection, humiliation, that is one of the pre-incident indicators we want to look at. Pre-incident indicators, my office abbreviates that as PINs. PINs are things that occur before a predicted outcome. It is a pre-incident indicator, for example, to becoming a police officer, that you go to the police academy. But I can go back further than that. It's a pre-incident indicator to becoming a police officer that you want to, that you talked about it when you were younger, that you knew a cop, that you admired, that you were drawn to it because of a television show. It is also a pre-incident indicator for becoming a police officer that you experienced some injustice as a boy or as a girl. Same thing for a prosecutor. But I mentioned that most of the boys who are picked on are alone. And because they're alone, their fuse is shorter, not longer. Like 16-year-old Luke Woodham, who shot 9 students at Pearl, Mississippi. 2 of them died, including his girlfriend, who'd broken up with him. His motive? Fellow students were picking on him. Another 16-year-old boy, Evan Ramsey, told friends that he planned to bring a gun to school and shoot some people. Pretty good pre-incident indicator. He kept his word on February 19th, a couple of years ago, when he killed the principal of the school. And he also shot 3 students, 1 of whom died. His motive? The boy he killed had been picking on him. Now, you will hear later today from James McGee. Dr. McGee has come to talk to you about the results of his study into the boys who've committed these crimes. You will hear that nearly all of the boys who commit terrible violence at school were teased and felt rejected. I know I have made clear that guns were the weapon of choice for most of the boys discussed today. And indeed, guns bring permanence to hostility that would otherwise be transitory. I heard yesterday from Dr. Robert Fine at the Secret Service that's looking at this as well. They're looking at what have we all learned about high-stakes predictions that can be brought to these high schools. And he told me that one of the cases that he was studying was a case of 2 boys who were just arrested for conspiring to blow up their high school in 2003. They're talking about it today. They want to do it in 2003. Does anybody in this room believe that those boys are going to retain that will over 3.5 years? They will not. That is an example of how transitory these thoughts are. This year, 3 boys, and you correct me if it's wrong, James, is it 3 in America that have committed multiple shootings at school? The 2 at Littleton and the 1 at Atlanta? And then this year, right, and then the 1 in Canada. So this year, 3 boys, or 4 in North America, have committed a multiple shooting at school. Does anyone in this room believe that they are the only 3 boys who ever thought about it? Are they the only 3 boys who planned it? Are they the only 3 who got the guns? Who built the bombs? Who advanced on their plans? They are not. They are the only 3 who went forward. It takes a lot to go forward. It takes a lot of anger, a lot of hostility, a lot of fear, a lot of self-loathing, and a lot of courage. Courage isn't a word you hear applied to these boys very often, but they have it. Willing to go into combat with a SWAT team, willing to be killed doing it, that's courage. You change a few knobs on these boys, and we call them heroes, killing someone in Iraq. Interesting, isn't it, that Eric Harris didn't get accepted into the military? Eric Harris seems uniquely qualified to go overseas and kill people. If he's willing to do it here, you won't have a lot of trouble convincing him to do it with brown people in Iraq. So, though I've talked about weapons, and they happen to be the weapon of choice, guns are not the main issue today. The main issue today is that we can spot the inclination toward violence in those around our teenage boys and in the teenage boys who move in that direction. But we can only do it if we know the pre-incident indicators, some of what Dr. McGee and others will talk to us about today. We can only do it if we know the pins. But our minds, unfortunately, are loaded with a lot of inaccurate pins. We all have ideas that we've gotten from our experience, and some of them are great, and some of them are weak. I learned yesterday at a meeting with the superintendent of schools here in the county and District Attorney Garcetti and some other experts who gathered to talk about these things in a small meeting, 8 people. I learned something I didn't know, that there were more expulsions for weapons-related violations in middle school than there are in high school. I wouldn't have known it. So I had a pin in my head that said, high school student, more dangerous, more of a problem than middle school student. That pin is inaccurate. Who loads us with the most inaccurate pre-incident indicators? The local news. The local news tells us things seem likely when they aren't likely at all. The reason it's on the news when an infant is kidnapped from a hospital is because it's rare, not because it's frequent. But what happens after that local news story? 50 more that say, what can you do to protect your infant in the hospital? Next up, a special hospital study, new security procedures going into effect. Can you miss that story if you're about to go in and have a baby? No. What you must know about the safety of your infants. Well, let me tell you the truth about kidnapping of infants from hospitals, just because it's a good little example. There were thousands and thousands of inches of print space given to this last year. New York Times did a whole giant article on it, a survey of hospitals to determine their security procedures. So I wanted to know, for this last book, how often does it happen? Because I couldn't figure out why somebody would kidnap an infant. An infant has no value to anyone else but you. Very few times a woman will kidnap an infant, a disturbed woman, because she can't have kids of her own. But what possible benefit? An infant is nothing but a giant pain to anybody except his or her parent. So why would human beings do it? That's the question I asked when I was writing this book. And I got my answer. They don't do it. Out of 4 million kids born every year in 3,500 facilities, about 7 are provably kidnapped every year from a hospital, and then I wanted to find out what happened to those kids. So I decided, as I always do, as we'll do today, you really want to look at 100 cases of something to get anything interesting from a statistical and research point of view. So I found 100 cases of children that were kidnapped from hospitals, infants, and I had to go back 15 years to do it. And out of the 100, 94 were returned the same day unharmed. And that is what we were reading about last year. That's the thing that's supposed to make women afraid when they're in the hospital. Honey, don't leave the baby alone. Put a wristband on him. Mark him 5 ways. Don't trust the hospital. That is an example of a pin, a pre-incident indicator, that is misloaded in people's heads because there is a business in our communities that benefits from making us afraid. How do you not watch a story that says, next up, the only way experts say you can protect your infant in the hospital? They're not going to say, next up, a big bullshit waste of your time that'll scare you to death. But that would be the truth. So I want to talk about how our minds get loaded with inaccurate information. About 4 or 5 years ago, I gave a talk, some of you were at the Central Intelligence Agency. It was a gathering of experts from all over the federal government and law enforcement talking about threat assessment. It was called the Threat Assessment Conference. First one like it that the CIA had ever done, first time they'd ever opened their doors and let us into that weird building. And so I was giving this presentation to all these threat experts around the country, and I was talking about pre-incident indicators. And I told them that every year about 20 people in Australia are killed by kangaroos, and that the kangaroos always do specific things before they kill. They always demonstrate that they're about to be violent in 3 very important ways. The first thing they do is they always smile. But of course they're not smiling, they're showing their teeth. So when the couple visiting Australia sees it, oh, he's smiling, honey. Isn't he adorable? He's actually getting more dangerous. And I told these folks at the CIA that the next thing that the kangaroos do is they look in their pouch to see if they have young, because they will not attack if their young are in their pouch. And the third thing they do is they look behind them because they got that great big tail and they're going to run away. They always attack viciously, kill, and then retreat. So here's the 3 things they do. The kangaroo attack pins. And then I asked the folks at the CIA what I would ask you now. I take those off the screen. There's nobody in this room who doesn't know those three things. And there's nobody in this room who will ever forget those three things, because they're about your safety. We collect that kind of information. We only have to learn one time that you put your hand in the fan, you'll be sorry. We spend our whole lives collecting that kind of information. We only have to have one particularly painful kind of relationship with someone before we know that's going to hurt, although we'll try it a few more times usually. Now somebody, the two young men in the room, can you tell me those three indicators of kangaroo violence? What will they do before they attack? Why do they look over their shoulder? And why do they smile? And why do they look in their pouch? Now, if you could learn that well in high school, maybe you are, maybe you're one of the great students, but the point is, if it's about our safety, we can't not learn it. So how are we living today? We're living where every day, for 40 hours of broadcasting a day, we are being bombarded with information about our safety. That's on the local news. Next up, home invasion robberies. Well, what other kind of robbery is there at home? You don't invite them in. Next up, an expert on carjacking and how to avoid it. And he'll put up warning signs, just like these warning signs. Man approaches car with gun. Thank you. Man says get out of car. Thank you. We have a joke in my office that next year they'll come out with, next up, robbers who hide in your purse and rob you when you get home. And they'll put up the warning signs, purse feels extra heavy. Strange noises coming from purse. The point of this is that we will go into today an exploration of this topic with a fully open mind if we realize that some of what's loaded into our brains may be wrong. Now, the thing about the kangaroo attack pins that many of you know already is that I made them up. Kangaroos do not attack people. If you ever go to Australia, forget these warning signs, because I don't know anything about kangaroos. But the point is, it's still going to be in your head your whole life. Now, later you're going to hear from Gregory Gibson, who lost his son in a school shooting. And you will hear about a case with astonishing negligence on the part of a school, and it's not our intent to use those critical observations or mine about some of the decisions that people have made with good intent in their hearts that have been wrong. Gregory, by the way, where are you? You're there. Good to see you. He took an astonishing journey into the murder of his son. He held the gun that killed his son. He met the people who sold it. He learned a great deal, and he'll tell you about that process, the process of the school seeking to avoid negligence. And his purpose in flying here today to be with us is not to blame. He's over that. It is to educate now. We know that high schools have very, very limited resources. And one of the reasons you'll hear from people talking about universities today, including Gregory, is that they are an interesting study because they have all the same safety challenges as high schools, but they have extraordinary resources. So it's interesting for us to find out, what would you do as a high school if you could have your own 50-man police department? What would you do if you could have, as Diane Sweeney does at University of Indiana, threat assessment systems and computerized artificial intuition systems? What would you do if you could be like UCLA, who uses a mosaic system for helping them as a tool that helps them with predictions? Well, we want to learn about what universities do because they will help us answer the question about what high schools can do if we give them a little bit of support, and not just in the form of money. The other way we can give them support is in the form of what I call a parent committee. Anyone who thinks that the challenges faced by schools can be easily dealt with is shown otherwise immediately by being on a parent committee. I propose that high schools develop a committee of people in their community who are parents that will meet to assist in developing policies about threats, as well as when to notify other parents. They can even meet to discuss specific cases, but there's a confidentiality issue. So I propose that high schools discuss the cases without the names and say, here's what we're facing today at our weekly meeting. We've got a kid who's stalking another kid. He dated her once. She won't let go. He's now talked about killing himself at school. What do? Will expelling him solve our problem? And that's what you'll hear about later from Scott Gordon, who's with the District Attorney's Threat Assessment Team, a founder of that team, and he'll run a panel talking about what do you do. But a parent committee is an interesting thing. I really recommend this to those of you who are with high schools to explore this. And there is a precedent for this approach in our society. For example, many large corporations develop committees that address safety, drawing on legal affairs and EAP and human resources and security, and they gather together to say, we've got a bad one, what do we do? School children deserve as much. When to bring in the police department. There's also a precedent for bringing members of the community together to help with other high-stakes decisions. It's an obvious one, a jury. And there are also police departments who brought together citizen groups to help solve crimes they couldn't solve. Smartest thing they ever did. You've got that terrible serial killer case in Owensboro, Kentucky, and everybody says the police are incompetent, they're Keystone cops, they're fools. You bring 15 people from the community into that case, and suddenly it all stops. Now they're not so foolish. Now the cops are not so dumb, because what would you do when it's easy to criticize and harder to come up with something original? Easier to criticize an idea than to come up with one. Now, schools can present information to parent committees, confidentially, as I said, and members of a parent committee can be appointed by the school board, by the principal. I don't care. They can be chosen for their level-headedness. That makes sense. They can be chosen for their high regard in the community. That makes sense. They can be chosen for their political connections. It doesn't matter. The only important qualification they need is that they've got a kid in that school, so that all the other parents don't feel that the principals and the administrators are making decisions about their sons' and daughters' safety without parents being consulted, as if school administrators are not also parents, but that's the way they've been treated, like they're not. And this committee can be convened whenever a case meets a particular criteria. And that may happen a few times a year, it may never happen. But parents will get a great deal of comfort knowing that they are represented in the process. Remember, the principal is the first authority figure most of us really saw outside the home. We're still intimidated by principals. Even as adults, we go in with our two kids to meet the principal, you'd think he was our principal. When in fact, he's our partner. Or she's our advocate. So what would a parent committee have said, I ask you, if they were presented with the case of Kip Kinkle that we discussed earlier, the boy who shot 20 of his classmates, and his parents? Of the facts known to school administrators at the time, there is one that called out pretty clearly the day before the shooting spree. I mentioned it to you already. He was arrested for bringing a gun to school. Pretty good pin. He had a gun in his locker at school. A friend had stolen it for him in a burglary and sold it to Kip, who needed it because his mother had just taken away his own guns. Well, as a school administrator, I would be very curious to know why his mother took away his guns, the very guns his parents had given him. After being suspended and taken to the police, as you know from that Oprah show, he was released to the custody of his father. And the problem is his father had started Kip's gun collection. But I'll tell you an interesting thing. Kip's father did not do it the way you'd think. Kip's father was not a big, tough, gruff gun lover. Kip's father was a teacher. So was his mother. They hated guns. They didn't like guns. They weren't gun people. But rather, what happened is Kip had begged for guns so often that his father finally gave in. Specifically the kid not to give it to, the one who brings it up so many times. Specifically the kid not to encourage about guns. But his dad said, look, he said to a friend, he's going to get one anyway. I might as well give it to him. At least it'll be from me. Which is a little bit like saying he's going to get crack anyway. I might as well give it to him. And he gave him the gun. He decided, even though a friend told him just give him a rifle, he decided to give him a semi-automatic pistol. And later he surprised Kip with a second handgun, a Glock pistol. And friends of the family said after the shooting, as always happens, that they were good parents. I don't argue that. They said they tried to be nurturing with Kip, but we have to wonder what inside that boy was really being nurtured by the gift of guns. It is not my preference to criticize parents who cannot defend themselves. In this case, I don't have any choice because Kip killed his mother and his father before he went to school that morning. But not knowing what they were thinking and not knowing what they would say if they were here today, we are left only with the facts of what happened. And imagine we could go back to that moment before the police released Kip to the custody of his father. We could go back to that moment and we could talk to the teachers and talk to the classmates. What would we learn? Here's what we would learn. Between the parents, the teachers, and the classmates and Kip, the only sources of information you ever need, here's what we would learn. He'd been building pipe bombs. He'd bragged about cutting up cats and squirrels. His parents knew he was troubled, and they'd taken him to therapy, and they've even tried homeschooling because they were worried he'd hurt someone. They had given him Ritalin and Prozac, the two opposite ends of the spectrum. His history of lethal behavior included an incident where he threw rocks off a freeway bridge. And in a speech class, as I mentioned earlier, he gave a presentation on how to build a pipe bomb, complete with illustrations. In a literature class, he read from a diary about his plans to, quote, kill everyone, close quote. Imagine yourself on that parent committee. You have just learned those facts about Kip Kinkle. Would you favor releasing him to the custody of someone, his father, who knew everything I just told you, and yet when he went shopping one day with $300 in his pocket could think of no better gift for his son than a second handgun? If a police department did the same thing anywhere in America, they'd be negligent. If a gun store did it, they'd be negligent. Now, I know there's 100 other factors that contributed to Kip's violence: social factors, cultural factors, personal, psychiatric, genetic, if you want to go down that road, psychological. But the fact is, if his parents hadn't given him those two guns, his would be the sad story of a sad kid. And instead, it's the sad story of hundreds of people damaged by his violence that day, 20 of them physically, 2 of them mortally, and all of them permanently. So if a parent committee and school officials had learned what you just learned, is there anyone here who thinks they would not have applied better intervention? I think they would have. I testified in another case against a school whose negligence facilitated some great harm to a young student. Not surprisingly, that school board chose not to send anybody to the event today. While it was easy to make a villain out of the principal in that case, and I did my part to do that, my entire time on the case caused me internal conflict. Because I had to ask myself, what kind of environment in that school where a principal knew what he knew and let this kid go back to class and victimize a second boy in that school, what kind of environment could possibly foster that much negligence? Does this principal, I said to myself, have to deal with so much awful stuff every day here in downtown Los Angeles that perpetrator's crime in the case I testified in was not a standout? And it appears the answer is yes. School administrators work beneath a glacier, a precarious glacier, of policies, politics, laws, liabilities, complaints, crimes, vindictiveness, violence. They oversee the most underpaid workforce in America. And put plainly, they cannot possibly accomplish what we expect them to accomplish, period. Not with the resources we're giving them and the resources we're failing to give them today. We don't have reasonable expectations as a society. Many school principals in this audience and many school administrators and school board members will agree with me readily that America is quick to be critical and not quite so fast to be helpful. And that brings me to this room, because we're here to help improve thinking in this field. And it isn't just to stop shootings like at Littleton. Remember, while America was shocked to see what happened at Littleton, shocked to see those kids killed at Littleton, the exact same number die every day in America anyway from gunfire. Where's the news? Every day, 75 kids are shot. 2 classrooms full of kids shot every day. Most survive. 15 do not. Notice that I did not say most recover. Recover is a news media word. 15 recovered. No, sir. They don't recover. Now, what you contribute here today is far more important than just helping victims of a few acts of random violence in America? We can help people today who need never become victims in the first place. And we can do another important thing. We can reduce fear in schools. We are the first gathering like this in the United States. The FBI is convening a group in a month. Secret Service is doing one. We are the first gathering of experts from around the country to talk about the predictive elements, this room. And we can help reduce fear in schools because though you wouldn't know it from the local television news, schools are still the safest place most kids ever go. Fewer than 30 kids were shot in multiple shootings this last year. And as I say, that number die in 2 days anyway from gunfire. And when I was in school, I got into trouble a fair amount. I finished high school in continuation school, which is where the bad kids go. And I got there because, among other things, I drove my car on the sidewalk at lunch. And it was the day that the superintendent of schools was showing the school to 15 people from around local media. It was a bad choice on my part. Another kid had done it a week before on April Fool's Day, and he got away with it. I didn't. I was suspended. I wasn't expelled. And later that night, after I was suspended, I was so angry that that other kid who did the exact same thing just a week before was not suspended. I had myself some justification. So I went back to school that night with 2 friends, and I drove the same car up on the sidewalk, and there's a great big lawn, and we just did donuts on the lawn, which was wet. We tore up the lawn. I wasn't a bad kid, but I was an angry kid, and I felt my justification to do that day. Well, telling you what I've just told you now, I am now talking to a room full of school superintendents and principals and police officers, any one of you who would have arrested me or suspended me or expelled me if you'd known me back then. I know one boy's vice principal of a high school in America who'd be very surprised right now. If he's dead, he is spinning in his grave. Very surprised that I would be here. And the point of my telling you that is that these boys, even Eric Harris, even Dylan Klebold, could have not committed these acts and could have gone on to contribute in extraordinary ways. Eric Harris's website that I read you that little piece of that's so visceral and ugly and angry and violent also has humor in it, and it also has wisdom in it. He was a very smart kid, Eric Harris. I don't know Dr. McGee, maybe most of them were very smart kids. But I want to close by saying that this room has some work to do, and I am so proud to be here with you doing this. And we've got a lot ahead of us. We're going to have some panels. We're going to hear from speakers who have a lot to contribute to us. The District Attorney of LA County is coming by to talk to us. And in LA County, that's a big deal. He's got 900 lawyers under him. Pardon me, I'm corrected, Counselor. He's got 1,100 lawyers under him. And you've all seen him on television many times on some high-profile case. But as I mentioned to you, he was good enough to do something very low-profile with us yesterday, and that was participate in that small meeting. So I want to thank you very much for coming. I want to tell you I look forward to meeting each of you today and to working with you when we break up into these groups. And I thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Dr. James McGee. He's Director of Psychology and Director of Law Enforcement and Forensic Services at Shepherd Pratt Hospital, located in Baltimore, Maryland. He's the Chief Psychologist of the Baltimore County Police Department, and he directs the Critical Incident Response Program for the Maryland State Police. Dr. McGee is a graduate of the the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Basic and Advanced Hostage Negotiations Training Program, and has also received FBI training in threat assessment and profiling. He's a special consultant to the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, and portions of a Unabomber profile he submitted to the FBI were used in search warrants related to that case. Dr. McGee is a trained executive protection specialist, and he's a diplomat of the American Board of Forensic Examiners. He's a recipient of the 1997 Maryland Governor's Award for crime prevention and his activities in hostage negotiations and hostage negotiations and crisis response. I've also had the pleasure of working with Dr. McGee in an advanced training workshop that we put on, a 3-day workshop, and we've had the ability to examine his work and discuss it with him over coffee and meals, and I want to tell you, he has a tremendous amount to offer. So please help me welcome Dr. James McGee.
Thank you very much, Robert, for that kind introduction. I'm like Mark Twain. I've had many interesting adventures in my life, some of which actually happened. And I'm delighted to participate in this important program today. And as a bonus, Gavin called my probation officer and arranged that this would count for part of my community service. So actually, I've only got about another 15, 20 minutes, and I'm out of here. So. On May 21st, 1998, in Springfield, Oregon, Kip Kinkle got up, had his bowl of cereal for breakfast, murdered his parents, drove to school, killed 2 students, and wounded 23 others in a shooting spree that you're all familiar with. 5 days later, in a rural area of Baltimore County, Maryland, a 15-year-old boy took a 9mm handgun, a loaded magazine, and a bouquet of flowers to school in what was planned to be a murder-suicide involving other students and some faculty at the school. This incident was averted by the actions of another student, and when we talk about prevention, that's one of the things I would like to emphasize. When we look at the profile, we'll see that these kids always broadcast intent beforehand, and that other students know who they are and know what they're planning on doing. So we need to somehow enlist the assistance of other students. The incident was averted, and this young boy ended up at my hospital, and I was assigned by the court to conduct the forensic evaluation on him. When I saw him, I was immediately struck by 2 things. He was a pleasant-looking, actually handsome young man, and he reminded me very much of some of the other students that had been involved in shooting incidents around the country. I thought that there were similarities. The second thing is there's a profile that some of you may already be aware of called the Workplace Avenger. It was developed by Roger Depew, who's former FBI. He's now with the Academy Group out of Arlington, Virginia. The profile that he developed describes these adult disgruntled employees who return to the workplace with an assault rifle and murder coworkers and supervisors. It occurred to me in talking to this boy and looking at the incident in Baltimore County that in many ways this was a teenage version of a workplace avenger. At that point, I contacted the FBI and spoke with an agent who's a friend of mine named Mike Napier. Mike also recently retired, and asked what the FBI was doing on school shootings, and he said that they'd opened a file and accumulated a fair amount of information, but hadn't really moved beyond that, and that I was welcome to come down, and they would share with me the information that they had. So along with Dr. Karen DiBernardo, who was a postdoctoral fellow in our law enforcement and forensic program, we drove off to Quantico. Karen was particularly delighted to be going down to the profiling division of the FBI because her favorite TV show is The X-Files, and her dog is named Scully. So when we arrived, however, she was somewhat disappointed because they moved off campus and are located in a very inconspicuous looking office building on Old Route 1 between a Meineke muffler shop and a Burger King. And when we pulled up, she said, "This doesn't look anything like that place on television." We spent the day with Mike and some other folks, and they provided us with a box load of information, mostly newspaper clippings, some police reports, some telephone interviews that they'd conducted, and we had about 20 cases. We returned to my hospital and narrowed it down to a dozen cases that we felt had the most complete information. And we put together the first draft of the profile, actually by about the end of June of last year. As you'll see, it proved to be quite predictive of subsequent events. I will not shoot my classmates. Anyone here go to Catholic school? Now, a lot of kids these days think that Bart Simpson was the one who started this. However, when I was in 3rd grade and my teacher, the dread Sister Bella Lugosi, often kept me late into the afternoon writing on the blackboard, "I will not do something or other." And Sister Bella Lugosi and her colleagues in the Order of Questionable Virtue knew how to manage children. And believe me, I would not wish my elementary and high school education onto anyone, but nonetheless, one of the things we'll see is that these incidents have occurred almost entirely, with one exception, they've occurred in public schools. Not that they won't happen in private schools, but at least in the Catholic schools of my era, the only ones who dressed like goths were the nuns. And the only ones who picked on and humiliated children were the nuns. They did not tolerate that. There was a certain standard of behavior, a certain set of expectations, a much lower tolerance for deviance than perhaps in the public school settings. And I think that when you get to the issue of intervention, we need to look at private schools, at what some of the differences are. Also, I would urge you to look at business and industry, because they have a 10-year head start on us, or a 15-year head start dealing with workplace violence. And I will argue that this is a particular type of workplace violence. There is a tradition in profiling where you have to come up with a dramatic name. And we chose the Classroom Avenger, but you have the Unabomber and the Green River Strangler and the Mad Bomber and things like that. We defined the Classroom Avenger as an adolescent male who perpetrates a non-traditional multi-victim homicide in a classroom setting. Unfortunately, we have traditional school shootings in the United States. And these typically occur in urban areas, involve juvenile gangs. The victims and perpetrators are often members of minority groups, and the motive is connected up to turf warfare, drugs, armed robbery, or self-defense. A number of people have asked why these haven't occurred in inner city schools, why these mass shootings. My hunch, and when you get to see the profile, maybe you will agree, is that the kids in the inner city schools who might fit this profile probably become victims early on, that they get picked on, but they get picked on to the extent that they get shot. Another possible explanation is that the kids in the inner city schools know that others are armed, which might make someone, it's almost the Charlton Heston argument, namely if you arm everybody in the school, then that will suppress this type of violence. And I don't know, I'm again just guessing as to whether that may have an effect. As I indicated, we were influenced by the work of Roger Depew with the Workplace Avenger profile. There, he stated that the precipitant was discipline or termination from employment. The primary motive was vengeance. The action was a premeditated shooting spree with the target victims being coworkers and supervisors. And you'll now see that there is really an analog for the school shooting incidents. Because with them, with the Classroom Avenger, you have a similar set of precipitants, namely some type of recent discipline by parents or school authorities, rejection by peers or a girlfriend. The primary motive is vengeance. There's a secondary motive that Gavin already referred to, namely it's a way of achieving instant celebrity status for kids who otherwise have nothing to feel particularly important about. The action is a premeditated shooting spree. The parents are analogous to coworkers and supervisors, namely they are parents, students, faculty, and school administrators. Here are the demographics. They're all male, all Caucasian. Average age is about 16. They're from predominantly middle-class backgrounds. The boy from Alaska was more blue-collar. The The geographic region is very interesting. If you look at the footnotes, 7 of the 14 incidents occurred within a 350-mile radius in 5 southern states, 4 of which are contiguous. There is most certainly a copycat effect operating here. David Phillips, a sociologist who's now at the University of San Diego, formerly from the Baltimore area at Hopkins, is the person who has most intensively studied the copycat phenomena. What influence does the media have? And what he's determined, if I were to summarize the findings, I think the best way to put it is that virtually any type of novel, innovative, creative, violent, self-destructive criminal activity, any novel, innovative, creative, violent, self-destructive, or criminal activity that receives high-profile media attention will be copied, usually within about 3 to 5 days. And the range of copycat goes from the epidemic of bomb threat hoaxes that occurred after Littleton. We had tons of them in my region, on up to actual replications of the crime, which is apparently what happened in the school in southern Alberta province. And the other thing that David has confirmed is that, not surprisingly, adolescents are particularly sensitive to a copycat effect. He first began looking at this with cluster suicides, and there were a number of very notorious examples of that. One of them was in Plano, Texas, where they had a Romeo and Juliet type suicide at a local school, and within a 90-day period after that, they had about 60 suicide attempts and about 7 or 8 completed suicides in that school district. So again, just to summarize, it's any type of novel, innovative, or creative violence, criminality, or self-destructive behavior with a lot of media attention. Seasonality, as I mentioned, primarily December through May, and these have occurred in these small rural communities. I think the largest one was Paducah. Here's information on the perpetrators. The verbalized threats, we really could say 100%. Since we made this slide up, we found out that the 16th one had made verbalized threats. Unlike the inner city school shootings where the guns typically come from the black market, with the exception of the Littleton, Colorado incident, the guns almost always came from home. In fact, we have identified ready access to firearms as almost a signature identifier here with the profile. The interest in military, occult, and weaponry, 100% of the kids were social outcasts. We could also say 100% felt teased and victimized because we have additional information that we didn't have when the slide was made up. I would also say that they're all suicidal. The next item, the next 2 items are very significant. Absence of a documented history of severe mental illness. None of these, now a number of these kids, and this also points to how difficult it is to identify these kids, or how difficult some people find it to identify these kids. A lot of these kids were being seen by a mental health professional at the time of the shooting. Most mental health professionals really are not particularly talented at doing risk assessment when first-rank signs are not present. You know, the first-rank predictors of violence, like compelling past history of violence, that's not present with these kids. That's what makes it so difficult. In school systems, 3 things tend to bring kids to the attention of school authorities. Failing grades. These kids are all average to above average students. Some of them were honor roll. Substance abuse. None of these kids were heavily involved in drugs and alcohol. And the third area is kind of in-your-face conduct disorder. The kid who's truant, the kid who repeatedly gets into fights in schools or threatens teachers, is highly disruptive in the classroom. Those 3 elements were not present with these kids. In addition, these kids have generally unremarkable physical appearance. They do not have bolts in their tongues, tattoos, and spiked purple hair. They're rather inconspicuous looking kids, other than that they may prefer military attire. My wife, who's a news writer and producer, but one of the best psychologists that I know, made an observation when we were discussing how adults generally don't recognize these kids, but the other students do. The other kids know who they are, and the other kids are much less surprised than the adults when the gun goes off. And she reminded me of when we would go to high school events, and on the way home, she or I would comment, "Gee, who was that kid, Freddie Jones? He seemed like such a nice boy." And my daughter would roll her eyes and say, "If you only knew." The kids we're talking about here with these particular types of shootings have an appearance of normality about them that's somewhat misleading to adults. So they don't have this documented history of what I would call apparent mental illness. By that I mean is these are not kids who are so disturbed that when you look at them as a non-mental health professional, if you look at them, it's not evident to you that they are crazy. And in addition, these are kids who are not known to the school authorities for being notorious troublemakers, and the police have had relatively little to do with them. The two boys in Colorado, they had an arrest for vandalism, for destruction of property. Destruction of property is not normally thought of as a first-rank predictor of violence. Kids who vandalize things generally don't go on to commit mass murder. But they have, of course, the interest in violence in TVs, movies, and music. Here's the victim information with 44 fatalities, 84 wounded. I'll call your attention to the far right column, the sex of the victim. At this point, we know that the overwhelming majority of victims are females. And as you're probably aware, after transportation accidents, the second leading cause of death in the workplace is homicide. For females, it's the leading cause of death. And that unhappy state of affairs evidently carries over to the school shootings, where, of course, you have a majority of teachers who are females, but also a disproportionate number of the student victims are females. What is often operating, and I should also add that the observation at Littleton that high-profile successful students were targeted is not in the least bit unique to Littleton. That's really been a theme throughout all the shootings we've looked at. The kids that do this are very angry and resentful of more successful kids. Not surprisingly, the more successful kids then end up as targets. But with females, we also found an interesting phenomena, and that is, in a number of instances, a well-intentioned, very popular, very attractive female student felt sorry for one of these kids, and on perhaps one occasion was friendly and cordial. The boy misinterpreted that as a gesture that she was romantically interested. He then would try to pursue her. Obviously, she didn't want anything to do with him. She would reject him, and she unfortunately would then end up being on the target list. Here we're going to take a look at the actual profile, and we're primarily focusing in on four areas: the demographic and dispositional, the historical factors, clinical factors, and contextual factors. And this is the Surgeon General's warning, which says that we have constructed a hypothetical portrayal of individuals who may have well above average potential to behave violently in a school setting. It's not, however, based on a statistical model, although we did run some small sample non-parametric statistics, and it's kind of a no-brainer. When you have 100%, it's statistically significant, well beyond a 0.05 level. But our database was a small number of cases with fragmentary data and some unconfirmed anecdotal. The construction of the profile was also based on a literature review, and there really is a nice literature on violence prediction. You could not say that 10 years ago, that in my era of training as a psychologist, it was very embarrassing because there were quite a few studies that showed that psychologists were there would be these studies where you would compare psychologists with clerk typists and plumbers in predicting violence, and invariably the clerk typists were best, the plumbers were next, and the psychologists were at the bottom of the list because we were looking at the wrong things. We would Instead of asking people, have you ever beat somebody up, we would look at their Rorschach responses. You know, do those things look like bloody strips of bacon or something like that? And so we were looking at the wrong things, but through the 70s and 80s, some people like that were already mentioned, like Gavin and John Monahan, Hart Dietz, folks like that, approached it like insurance agents do. They took a much more actuarial approach and came up with good information. The punchline here is that this is a work in progress. Although we've used it in Maryland, we have successfully averted 2 incidents in Maryland using this profile, and if we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about that. But also what I'm alerting people to here is that one of the obvious problems with profiling is what's called false positives and false negatives. False positive is somebody who meets the profile but doesn't perform the target behavior, and a false negative is somebody is a elderly Jewish grandmother who commits mass murder, that she doesn't fit any of the profile criteria, but she does perform the target behavior. Okay, here are the demographic and dispositional factors. They're all Caucasian, they're all male, and if a young lady in the audience would please ask why they're all male, I'll talk about that. Their average age is about 16. The 2 boys in Jonesboro kind of brought the age curve down a bit. They're blue collar to middle class. And again, you need to write this stuff down. If you call that phone number, you'll get the whole profile. They're from rural communities and they're physically healthy. Their families are dysfunctional, which should come as no surprise, but it is subtle dysfunction. These are families that are not well known to social service agencies. The police have not been going to the family home to break up domestics. So these kids are crazy, but they're crazy in a subtle, non-obvious way, and the families are not working very well either. The kids have a family pedigree among first-degree relatives for some type of mental illness, personality disorder, or substance abuse. Their physical appearance, as I noted before, tends to be quite unremarkable. The 2 boys that you've seen pictures of in Colorado were very handsome young men. Their body image, however, is quite unattractive, and the peers see them as geeks or nerds. Let me also comment quickly on the families, and Gavin touched on this issue of what's going on in the families. I certainly think in some cases the parents just were quite clueless, had no idea how to raise children. In other families, there may have actually been some direct rejection and hostility and abuse of the kids. But I also think that there's a third scenario, and namely, these are kids who are born with very prickly temperaments, that they're little porcupines. They're not warm, cuddly, cozy kids. They don't respond to nurturance the way we hope children will. These are the kids that by the time they're 6 or 7 years old, they have already put up the sign on their bedroom door, "Do not enter," and they really mean it. And unfortunately, the parents are dumb enough to go along with that. The parents end up being trained by these kids to stay away from them. They're doing all right in school. Their grades are good. The school's not complaining about them. The police aren't coming to the house all the time. So the smart thing is, let's just leave them alone, stay away. So by the time they're adolescents, if they're down in the basement building a bomb, at least they're quiet. They're not giving me any trouble, so I'm not going to fool with them. So I think that third scenario probably is operating here. Here's the historical factors, and we approach this from a developmental standpoint, beginning with infancy and early childhood. These aren't kids who are severely handicapped, disabled, or mentally retarded. However, as I said, I think that a lot of these kids are what I would call high-maintenance children. They probably are colicky, temperamental kids with some delayed developmental milestones. Most importantly of all, these are kids with real problems in the area of bonding and attachment. You can't have the normal juices of compassion and commit these types of horrible crimes. And I also should comment that in terms of victims, there were in Columbine 1,000 victims at least. There are tons and tons of children that were in that school or attended that school or witnessed this who will never have another carefree day of their lives. We know that post-traumatic stress disorder often becomes a chronic condition. But again, the issue with bonding and attachment, I think, is quite significant. These are unaffectionate, standoffish kids who probably have an exaggerated fear of strangers. Whoops, going the wrong direction. Early on, these are the children that show antisocial tendencies of lying and deceit. The old thing your granny told you about bedwetting, fire setting, and animal abuse really is true. There's good data to support that little kids who have that triad are more at risk for violent behavior later on, particularly if you accompany the bedwetting, fire setting, and animal abuse with very early onset lying and deceit. And the little kids, the nursery school kid who throws tantrums where they attack a teacher, or the little kid who will get physically violent with an adult.